Go.
Okay, so I'm anticipating us not using the full hour, but thank you all for being here for Formative and Summative Assessment. I'm Derek Salinas-Lazarski, the Associate Dean of Life Sciences here at Triton College. And for those of you who have ever attended one of my CTE presentations before, I'd like to give this disclaimer at the top, which is that I'm going to assume that you are all great teachers and you all know everything I'm going to talk about in here. This is just a refresher or for us to kind of explore some of the details, or maybe you just picked something up that you hadn't thought about for a while. But my second disclaimer is I love talking about the theory, but I always want to be able to give you stuff, concrete strategies that you could employ if you had to teach in an hour or tonight. You know, I want this to be easy, concrete stuff that could slip into a lesson plan in just about any discipline on the college at the college, because when you boil it down, good teaching is good teaching. So, with that said, let's hide this and let's move forward. So we're going to talk about formative and summative assessment today. You can either do your mics or just do it in the chat. What is assessment? Can someone define assessment for me? Oh no, I'm making you work right out of the gate. That's not what we were ready for. Getting lost, knowing students. Yeah, exactly. Assessment is figuring out what your students know. What do they know? Could happen at any part of the teaching process, but if it's in the middle or toward the end of the teaching process, then the assessment isn't just what your students know, it's also how well did you teach your students, right? If you're assessing them on things that you've taught them. So we're going to take kind of that package and use that to move forward in this presentation. Not just what do our students know, but what have we taught our students? Okay, traditional assessment, we know part of what this presentation is trying to do is to break us out of the mold of what a traditional assessment is. You know, we all grew up with the Scantron multiple choice true false test. Assessment is a culmination of learning. It's always graded. I had a student last week, I was trying to advise them, stop worrying about your grade. I want you to worry less about your grade and worry more about what you're learning, because you know when you're far off away from Triton College, you know no one's going to care what's on your transcript. They're going to care, can you do the thing? Can you do the thing? And that's what's important for us as teachers. So we kind of want to, part of the goal of this presentation is let's move away from what traditional assessment is, okay? And so in order to do that, I want to talk about a few different types of assessment. So those of you who are engaged in the assessment committee here, assessment is a big thing that's really ballooned and taken off in higher education in the last 10 or 15 years, and rightly so. There's a lot of different types of assessment, though, as a result of that. And those of you engaged in the assessment committee are probably familiar with these kinds of things. If you're not, but you're still a full-time faculty member, it does behoove you to know what these things are, even if you're not engaged in the immediacy of the work. First is classroom assessment, and that's what we're going to be talking about today a little bit. This is our traditional assessment. What's going on in the classroom? Are your students learning? But there's some other ones. There's course level assessment. So say, for example, Rhetoric 101 or Math 110. How are we doing as a college all the way across the board in this one course? Because then maybe we can take what we're doing well and where we can improve and use that to improve the curriculum. Similarly, you could expand that and talk about program level assessment. So this is we could either talk about, it's more difficult maybe in my area as an academic dean, because in arts and sciences we have so many of the gen eds, but we have our biotech program, we have our health careers program, we have education. We're engaging in embarking in guided pathways with the program maps. All of these are open to be able to assess constantly How well are those maps and the programs teaching and readying our students for what they say they are, whether that's a job or a four-year transfer degree? And finally, this is my personal favorite, general education outcomes assessment. Trenton College has our 5 general education outcomes. Off the top of my head, I believe they are communication, information literacy, global literacy, critical thinking, and what's the 5th one? Does anyone know? We should find the link. I should know that. Our general education outcomes are baked into so many of the courses all throughout the college. And so on a yearly basis, we pick one of those 5 general education outcomes. This semester, we are working on written communication. And next semester, we're doing oral communication. So we're taking communication, we're splitting it into 2 semesters to determine across the entire college, in gen ed programs, in career programs, in all of our courses, how are we assessing, how well do we teach these general education outcomes? So if you remember last year, we did critical thinking all the way across the board, and we looked at English classes, psychology classes, automotive classes, all the way across the board, and we presented on some of that. And actually, exactly 1 week and 1 hour from now, I'll be presenting on critical thinking with Christy Reese, based on our gen ed assessment critical thinking last semester. So you can see here, there's so many different ways that we're assessing at the college, because what is this? This is all investigation to how well we're doing our job. And I think part of the problem with assessment is some people are reticent about it because they are worried because they don't necessarily want to know the areas where they can improve. Some people are better than that at others. I'm not judging. I'm merely noting a psychological phenomenon. So I think that's what contributes to sometimes people, again, like not wanting to engage in coursework as much. Thank you so much, Swan. Critical thinking, these are our gen ed outcomes in the chat. Critical thinking, communication, information literacy, quantitative literacy, and global learning. Twan, as someone in the math department, I want to apologize to you for leaving quantitative literacy off. That doesn't make me feel good. All right, I'll make it up to you. Lastly, student affairs assessment. And this one is getting a lot more traction, but in higher ed, but people don't really know how to do it very well. How well are we doing on the student affairs side? It's so much more difficult because there's way less quantitative metrics, etc. However, it's important to note that this is another important type of assessment. So let's focus on classroom assessment, like I said, because we're talking about formative assessment here and summative assessment. So we've got 2 types. One type of assessment is comprised of activities, lets students know, instructor know how much students have learned, and is often not graded. And the other one's tests and quizzes, combination of learning. You probably already guessed it. One is formative and the other is summative, and this mnemonic is so easy to me. Formative assessment is happening during the formation of learning, okay? And summative assessment is usually there's no learning or teaching going on after the summative assessment, at least in the classroom. Formative assessment and summative assessment. And so much of what I want to do in this presentation and do for the culture of Trenton College is get us to realize summative assessment is not the only kind of assessment, right? We're assessing our students all the time. And the more I think that as an instructor you're cognizant of their opportunities to assess your students all the time, the more information you have to be able to judge where to go with those students. Formative assessment is so important. It gives you information about where to go and what to proceed. What are your students learning and how well? What are they struggling with? What needs to be reviewed? Should you change the lesson? Should you change the assignments? I'm not a fan of instructors that I've had in the past. Like I remember professors that I had from undergrad where they've been teaching for 20 years and they had taught the same lesson for those 20 years, and they were, you either got it or you didn't. Versus, maybe this is just a stylistic thing, but then there are other instructors who are really dynamic and engaging and really respond to the personality of the class or the needs of the students. I'm not saying be on one end of the spectrum or the other, but the more tools you can have in your toolbox, the better off I think you'll be. So let's talk about formative assessment, because formative assessment, I feel like good teaching is flexible and creative and meets the students where they're at while also sticking to the learning outcomes, or maybe kind of reimagining different ways that you could engage in the learning outcomes or get students to engage in the learning outcomes if the traditional route isn't necessarily working. So, all that said, let's go into the chat, or let's go into turn on our mics, and you tell me, what are some types of formative assessments that you have used in your classes, and how they helped you kind of gauge what you were doing in that class. Projects. Tuan, I'm going to ask you to explain a lot more than that.
Well, hello everyone. Yes, I'm Tuan. I use projects such as like group discussions or group projects where individuals will work in pairs on a certain activity. Like recently, my students were working on a project where they have to collect data from each other, and then also where they had to present it in a Venn diagram. So they had to discuss how they were going to present it, but each group did not have the same topic. However, it was the same overall subject matter, so it was actually dealing with logic and Venn diagrams.
So, as an instructor, what information did you glean from your students that helped you figure out how to
Well, I wanted to figure out their critical thinking, how they approach the assignment, and how they are creative in the sense of gathering the information from their classmates. It was also a written assignment, so they had to develop their written skills in regards to how to communicate to me how much they collected the data and how much they collected information from their peers. It was also information literacy in regards to learning how they shared information with each other and how they actually put it together. So it's actually dealing with the 5 objectives. And then quantitative literacy about it as how they approach the problem in its logical form, and then explaining how they, I guess, communicated with each other too, because it wasn't part of the class, it was outside the classroom. So they had to present everything in a 3-page paper in regards to how they approached all 5 objectives.
That sounds very cool and comprehensive. It sounds like you learned. Can you mute your mic and hear myself echoing in the background? But it sounds like you've got a lot of inspiration from a project like that.
Well, yes, because the fact that I was telling my students in regards to doing a test or a quiz, yes, those are the things that we normally do within the classroom. However, I'm approaching it in the sense of how they're going to be utilize those skills outside the classroom. And the important part of the project was communication and then the critical thinking skills. So it was actually doing that in the sense of applying those skills that I'd learned from, yes, I'm on the assessment team, but then also looking at the Association of American Colleges and Universities and saying what students should know going outside or graduating from the institution and what they're going to be applied into the workforce.
Yeah, that's great. I really love it, specifically how you were focusing on critical thinking and communication too. Like you're thinking to yourself, I'm looking for these 2 things and some other things, but focusing on these 2 things to see where my students are at. That's great and really effective. Kevin wrote quick written summaries of aha moments that they had in class. I think that sounds really interesting because that gives you a gauge as an instructor of like what kind of what information really had they not encountered before, right? What did I teach them that kind of blew their minds? And that's a big part of what we try and do in college, not to pat ourselves on the back, but is really open up students' perspectives. And I feel like moments like that, aha moments, are really strong like that. Um, and then one thing, Gretchen, one thing you still have a question about from today's lecture as an exit slip question. Gretchen, can I ask you, I want to know when you get those exit slips and you're looking at them after what either an example or a hypothetical of like what is some did you ever have a situation where those exit slips caused you to change direction in your next lesson?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, like over the years, of course, where I've might be explaining something and I mean, I could even use an example for today. We were talking about this is so stupid, but different types of consumer products and why the psychological of why people buy what they do. And we went through several scenarios of them. And the my last thing, and it wasn't really necessarily asking an exit slip, but it was, I want everybody to email me after class your answer to this final one. Like we had done 6 of them to this final one that we had done. And so I've gotten some of them back already, and I would say they haven't necessarily grasped this concept yet. So on Wednesday, when I kick off class, I'm definitely going back to it. Even though some of the students understand it, some of the other students don't. And I don't think that you can move on as an instructor, especially with what this is a pretty crucial part of the marketing mix. So, so I'll go back to it. And I also think sometimes that giving explaining things differently as well. I explain something the way that I think they're going to learn it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're learning from me that way.
I think that you made two excellent points there. Number one is the totally classic situation of like I explained to the teacher, I thought they all got it. They all nodded their heads at me. And then when I tried to do a form of assessment, I realized like only half of them got it, half of them like didn't get it at all, you know?
Right.
And they're not necessarily going to tell you. And when you do that thing, you're like, any questions? Any questions?
Right.
No one's going to raise their hand, even the people who have questions. So, yeah, I think that's great. Um, the other thing that you know that I think is so important is when you said explain it, like explain it a different way, and you come into the class like we all had a class that didn't go as well as we thought it would, or they just didn't understand it. We had to figure out a different way to explain it. And in general, the research tells us like the more ways that we can explain something, the more different ways that we can get students to engage different material, it's going to make more connections. They're going to learn it better and learn it more. And sometimes you think like, okay, I can just explain this concept and they'll get it. It's kind of simple and then we can move on. But no, maybe like you said, you have to spend the beginning of the next class period or most of it, or sometimes you lose a whole one or two just going over the same thing because they're not getting it in one class that's far behind another one, then etc. So you really have to be flexible. You have more, Gretchen?
Well, I was going to say too, I would say the one thing that I'd like to teach face to face. I think I make that very clear. But one of the things that I have also, to your point, taken away from this sort of blended ideal, because I don't really lecture when I have them virtual, is that by taking these concepts that I'm trying to teach them, since I'm more of a program-based career, but instead of just sitting there and lecturing and trying to explain the concept, I now have taken the time to find videos and podcasts and lectures, and then be able to present those, and then a little bit like Tawan was saying, then breaking them out into their like little breakout groups, right? To then reassess, did you as a group then come together to make sure that yes, this concept, this idea, this whatever you're going to take into management, this is what you're going to do with your people, has been attained. So I think that is just that whole concept of reinforcement, I think it's huge.
reinforcement, and then it sounds like you're doing formative assessment like in a loop, kind of like over and over.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing it multiple times. And for like one concept, you're doing that formative assessment many times before you get to an actual graded summative assessment on it.
Right, exactly. Because I guess I don't know, when they leave, I want to know that those 12 students that I have understand the concepts of whatever I'm teaching.
Yep, totally.
So,
Totally. That's all great. That's all great. Okay, so if you didn't guess, I'm so meta in my presentations. This question right here is a formative assessment of all of you, right? See where you're at. So let's see what else, what I have here. So just like this is the nuts and bolts toolbox slide. Ask the class a question. See how they respond. Are they hot or cold? Do they know this? Are they really thoughtful? Or are they all deer in the headlights? And then alongside of that is like the classroom discussion is more like how they interact with each other, engaging the material. Those are more for like a qualitative, maybe leaning humanities type course. More of a quantitative, more STEM type course could be practice exercises. Going over the homework, something we've been doing in math classes since the beginning of elementary school, is a great form of assessment. Got some more quizzes, ungraded or graded. I know there's so many different types of creative ways to do that, or give extra credit or whatever. Anonymous responses, that goes to kind of Kevin's written summaries and Gretchen's exit slip. Have students explain the concepts. I love this more and more, like this flipped classroom approach. Like, what do you know? Okay, let's talk about the War of 1812. You tell me, what do you know about the War of 1812, or what do you know about online marketing? Like having them explain to you and giving them is a great way to assess. Like, okay, here's where their baseline is, and here's where we have to go from. And then informal surveys too are great. Or like when we do those there are those question games, like who you can have multiple choice and have it on the screen and have it anonymous. Those are really great ways to gauge students' information, especially if they're anonymous. And so this kind of echoes the other question, but kind of like from a discipline standpoint, we've got Tom here is from bio, Tuan is from math, Gretchen is from business. I'm from English. We have kind of a good selection. Kevin, I'm not sure what your background is. Anyone want to give us some like a form of assessment specific to your discipline? For me in English, like I would just have to art history. Okay, great. So we have a great selection of perspectives here. In English, I would have students write for 5 minutes every day, and it would be totally ungraded. It'd be in a different prompt, and I could collect them and just always kind of see if it was kind of like based on something we had discussed, or it was just a prompt of something completely out of the blue. I could check and see not just grammar, because whenever you talk about writing, it's like, oh, grammar. It's like, no, it's like sentence organization, depth of thought, connection of ideas, bringing outside sources, of those kinds of things. Any other kind of form of assessment specific to your discipline you feel like is worth mentioning? I don't know if I could think one up for art history off the top of my head, but I do love art. No? Think about it. Think about it. I'm sure they're there. I'm sure that many of you use a lot of these. Graded and ungraded quizzes, good for math. Oh, having students practice image identification like they're in a museum. Kevin, I'm going to put you on the spot and make you talk about that now, because I find that really interesting.
So one thing that we could do, and totally no pressure on the students, we're talking about formative assessments. And so you asked about design specific discipline or discipline specific things. I could just throw up images on a screen really quickly and just pretend we're in a gallery and just have them immediately you know, the name of the piece maybe, or the association of the artist, or maybe it was about the storyline that's represented in the image, but just getting them to practice talking about it, as again, real informal, but it is revealing. A moment ago, you said a really good point about having students practice what they know. And, you know, sometimes that's really revealing, right? Like with the aha moment, they had this aha connection, and then I hear it and I'm like, oh, actually, that's not quite right. I mean, they got something, but you have to you know, you have to carefully adjust or correct, you know. And anyway, that was a really fun activity that was like real world learning. Like they're going to find themselves in a museum one day, I hope, and have to go through that exercise. And so this was a way of kind of making it more real to them.
I love that because it sounds fun. The stakes are so low. You're just throwing up paintings or pieces and just talk about it, you know. And it's like you're just like you can build class community. You can break people out of their shell a little bit, but also behind the scenes, you're doing formative assessment about what they know, what's their vocabulary like to be able to speak intelligently about different pieces. Can they talk about styles or techniques, but maybe they're not really good at like looking at schools of art or saying who the artist might be, etc. So I think that's such a fun, really like low stakes activity with actually a lot going on behind it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Did you
true.
want to comment more? Yeah. Okay, cool. So we're gonna send out the PowerPoint. Like I said, I always have a big long list of, like I said, the toolbox slide. This is all stuff you can bring in and spend 10, 15, 20 minutes, a half an hour on any one of these tonight. If you have some time and don't know what to do with it, you know, because any one of these can be extremely constructive for getting information from your students about how they're learning, or engaging them, re-engaging them in the content and the material. And I'm always an advocate of like Kevin's idea or Twan's project, just making it as fun and interesting as possible, because we know that increases the learning too. And who doesn't want to have fun? Summative assessments. So just want to run over this really quick. But summative assessments are the culmination of learning. And again, I feel like as a culture, as a society, we put too much on summative assessments. I'm always trying to tell my students or instructors, don't focus on the grades as much, because the grades are not nearly as important as what you are or aren't learning. But the culmination of learning, tests, essays, projects, portfolios, very much depends on what your discipline is in. But the point I really want to make is Bloom's taxonomy. And you know, Bloom's taxonomy, for those of you who've seen me, you know that I talk about it so often, because it's a really quick, easy, and very important tool for looking at all the different ways that we can engage a question or a discipline or a topic. And I would argue that in just about every discipline, most courses, your summative assessments are really trying to engage students in all aspects of Bloom's taxonomy. Obviously, students are they're learning the knowledge of the course, and they're understanding the context, that's comprehension, and then they're learning how to apply the knowledge. But then in the summative assessments, you're trying to push them even further, right? You're trying to get them to take that knowledge to analyze something new, or to create something new, or to even evaluate something, okay? So we've got lots of different basic test questions, true, false, multiple choice, matching. A lot of these really, the more objective ones are only usually looking at the bottom half of Bloom's taxonomy. It's not until you really start getting into fill in the blank or short answer or even essay questions when you really start engaging the students' higher levels of critical thinking. And you know this if you've ever taken a prep class for SAT or ACT or GED, because they teach you about the true false questions and multiple choice questions, right? they teach you to use process of elimination or eliminate something that just sounds really off, or true false, know that they're usually trying to trip you up on one word. So if they use something like always, or they use, then more likely than not it's false. Okay, and so I just worry that a lot of times on tests and in some of assessments, some of those types of questions aren't actually testing the content, but they're testing students' ability to take the test. You know what I mean? And I would say there's some equity issues that go into that, because it speaks to like our structure, American structure of test taking in general, etc. I'm not saying don't ever use true, false, multiple choice, etc. But just be hyper intentional about it. Just know exactly what areas of Bloom's taxonomy those questions are testing on, because more often than not, it's really knowledge and comprehension and maybe some application. Whereas when you're getting into short answer and essay, that's when you're really testing the higher levels of critical thinking, which is really what you're trying to do. Even though critical thinking is just one of our gen ed outcomes, critical thinking pervades all the other ones, because it is about how do we take that knowledge and our understanding of the context of the knowledge, and then be able to problem solve or create in new, exciting ways. That's what we're pushing our students to do. So my thinking about summative assessments is that they should be directly connected to the course learning outcomes that are on your syllabi. Okay, when in doubt, go back to those course learning outcomes. They more often than not have a Bloom's taxonomy verb at the start of it. Okay, have your summative assessments mirror assessments given throughout the class, or show them what it looks like. Don't just spring things on it, and potentially have students do what the course is preparing them to do. I know a lot of you do this. A lot of our great faculty do this, but for example, in an automotive class, as a summative assessment, you could give them a true, false, multiple choice test, but a better one would be get them under the hood of the car, and have them show you where the fuel pump is, things like that, so like have them think, I've got Tom Kanan in here. I know, like, you do a lot of great assessments, Tom, in the cadaver room, hands-on stuff. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So just something to keep in mind, and then address multiple levels and types of thinking in your summative assessments as well. To do, this is my summative assessment for all of you, so I want to hear what's the summative assessment in your discipline, or let's keep it easy, one thing you learned today that you think you can bring into your teaching. Now, I will sit in the awkward silence while you're all thinking a little bit. Some of the multiple choice exams and the final essay, combining them, I think that's great. That's great. Like the picture concept that Kevin introduced, I would love to figure out for you, Tuan, how that would translate to math class, college algebra, or something like that.
Well, I think it would be more applicable to my math literacy course, but like by Math 8E, which is the math literacy class, and then also Math 101, which is quantitative literacy, and Math 102, which is the liberal arts math, and using pictures to associate how math is applied in different areas, especially finding out from my students their majors and also their career choices, and using mathematics and pictures to, like Kevin was saying, I'm trying to work it out. I think it's a cool concept. I want to try to do it for the summer and see how it relates to like I said, their discipline and also their career choices, and saying that looking at a picture can tell 1,000 or say 1,000 words, but using it also to say 1,000 mathematical equations or whatever.
That is so. I love it. I love it, Tuan. Because you know what it makes me think of is when I was teaching English 101 when I started in higher ed. I would pull articles just from the news that because I was teaching, I would just be reading the news in general and just be like, oh, this would be a great article. Or we were just talking about this. I want to bring this in and have the students talk about this or write about it. And I just think if I'm not a math teacher, but if I was teaching math literacy, you could find examples. If you like kept your eye open, find examples of that going on in the world all the time. COVID and the COVID numbers are an obvious example, but you could beat that to death. But just if you keep your eyes peeled, I'm sure you'll find plenty of things out there in current events that would qualify. So that's a great idea. So here's my final thoughts on this topic. So please use your formative assessments to teach, engage where your students are, and this is the more difficult one. Adjust your class plan or your semester plan based on your students. Be flexible, be creative. I think a lot, I'm kind of preaching to the choir here in this group, just based on some of the conversations we had and knowing you. But we do know that there are instructors who really have a difficult time with this, and I would encourage them to branch out. And then in combination with that, use formative assessments as teaching tools as well. Having students get all the answers wrong on the homework is not a bad thing if you're going to take that homework and then use it to teach them. Or just throwing some artwork up and just having a conversation and talk about it is a great opportunity also to teach and branch off into something new. Or, hey, you didn't know about that? Okay, pull up your phone, look it up on Wikipedia, tell the class what it says about El Greco or whatever. Okay. And then I would recommend have your sum of assessments match your teaching methods and content. So hopefully just taking a more critical eye or looking at some of the assessments that perhaps you've used over and over again, which does happen in teaching, and that's perfectly great, but it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be under scrutiny, perhaps like every time you use them. So those are my final thoughts. This is me. A lot of you know me. I want to thank you all for being here, and I want to just leave a little bit of time if there are any other questions or comments that people want to make on formative and summative assessment.
Well, Derek, sorry, if I may, I like that they're ending thought because every semester I always try something different and I never try to repeat the same thing because that's why I find out from my students, A, their majors, B, their career their career choices or whatever they want to do, their educational goals, if it is just getting an associate or going on to their bachelor's degree. And then lastly, to find out how, for me being a math instructor, how mathematics is going to be applied in their everyday lives.
Mm-hmm. That's so great. I love that. And it's that level of self-awareness, Tuan, that I think makes a good teacher, which, I knew you were anyway, but it's just great to hear you articulate it. Thank you. Tom, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just want to kind of address something that you have mentioned, I think, in the beginning of the presentation, and I totally agree with you when you said, and this is something I'm struggling with all the time, is that, trying to tell the student, don't focus on the grade, right? Focus on the knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But I think at the same time, sometimes it's hard because when those students want to continue and get into programs and you need to have a certain GPA and then they're like, oh, I must have an A. And when they have that kind of thoughts in their head, sometimes it's very hard to kind of, convince them, hey, don't worry about the grade, focus on the learning part, and because you're not going to have that stress, don't worry, the grade will come with it. But I find it hard when they always kind of being fed that, you got to have that GPA, you got to have A's, and this is how you get to a program. So I'm just always struggling, like, how can we get them out of this?
So I think that's great. So number one, you're absolutely right. That pressure is real for a lot of students. They know what school they want to get into. They know what their GPA needs to be to get into that. So that pressure is real. I would say my advice would be twofold, okay? So the first one would be just don't stop having this conversation. Don't stop. You don't have to beat them over the head with it, but don't stop reminding them. Be like, hey, we can talk about the grades, but I'm telling you the content's more important. You're going to feel the same way in 10 or 15 years, I understand you want to get into this school or blah, 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 and that's great. Focus on the content as much as you can and just constantly gently remind them, and that will be really helpful. And then number two, this could be part of that conversation, or for you, the grade ideally should connect directly to their knowledge of the content, right? And part of that could be in presentation of material. Part of that is also making sure your summative assessments are aligned directly with the content and some of the concepts that we've heard here. But also, if they focus on the material, ideally the grade is just going to follow. There's sometimes when a student I think this is the tricky situation. When a student and I think we've all had a class like this where we tried really hard, but that one class just didn't click for us. And we were grateful to get out of the class with a B or a C, when something below our standard. And that can be really tricky, but that's when you just really turn up as a teacher, turn up the motivation, turn up the encouragement, turn up the office hour usage, etc. So I think just keep having that conversation. Let them know, like, I get it about the grade, but I'm telling you the content's more important. And theoretically, if they learn the content, the grade should follow. Is that helpful?
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, I totally get it. I'm also wondering if we, let's say, start to change even more, right, the way that we do assessments, and kind of, if you will, it will be even less stressful. But then what happens when they go into those programs, and those programs, there it's just, their assessments are kind of more of summative, and like, or where they're taking, let's say, their license exam is a summative kind of thing. So in a way, if with us, let's say, we are not even in kind of give them those environment or that environment, do you think they will do better when they're going to get into those programs, when they are not doing so much formative assessment, everything is summative? I'm talking when they're going even to like grad schools. Then I'm just wondering, like, because I think, like, it's good that we will change, and that's great, but I think it's also require kind of more of, the entire system will change with it.
So that's a very good point. But remember, I did not say do not make your summative assessments stressful. All I said was make sure you're preparing them for them. But what I did say was align your summative assessments to what the students need to know and what you're preparing them for. So if you're in a field that has lots of exams like that, like in nursing, for example, I think it totally makes sense to have your summative assessments being preparing them for licensing exams, the level of stress, maybe in the structure of the exam, if you can swing that. But alongside of that, I think for me, doing formative assessment on their mental and emotional preparedness for that stressful situation. And again, you work with cadavers, so I know that this is part of what you do anyway, but I think that goes alongside it. Everyone has stressful tests, that they need to take. I'm not saying shy away from that at all. Sometimes you got to give a 2-hour long 200-question final, and they got to be prepared for it, and they're going to worry about the grade and all of that. However, that's where formative assessment is so key, and not just like what are they knowing, but how are they feeling about it? How are they preparing for it, right? Like you can just constantly be gaining information about different ways that you can help prepare them. Hey, when I took this class X amount of years ago, here's how I studied for it. Like there's so many different ways that you can prepare them. So I would say if you're teaching in the field with licensing exams, like create some of the assessments that are going to prepare them. Doesn't mean it's not going to be stressful, but you can prepare them for that stress as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think for me personally, what I find sometimes like the gap, if you will, is that let's say you can teach, right? And you can do the formative assessment, but sometimes what I find the gap is that students, they, just because how they came even from high school, they just adopt a specific learning skill which was designed really more for summative assessment. And that basically is, let's memorize. But which is a good tool. I'm not saying that it's bad, but it's a good tool that serves certain things. But this is the only really tool that they know, that they perfected over the years. And that's what I find most of the time. It's not about, understanding the material. It's like how to study, how to take notes. And that's sometimes what I find it's the problem is that even when they sit in the classroom and they want to learn something, they don't know how to study it. They know how to write it. They know how to highlight it. They know how to make cards about it. Yes, but how to study it, how to make it easier that they will understand, I think sometimes that's the gap. And sometimes I find time spending by learning how to learn, not necessarily now the material itself, but how you study. What does it mean to take note? How you should take a note? What's the purpose of even taking notes? Why are you even doing it? I think sometimes this is the gap that I find in the classroom.
And I think that is such a great conversation. Just be open about it and engage them in that. And start that conversation at the beginning of the semester and have it continuously going on. The metacognition part, the how are you learning, how are you studying part, tell them, hey, I start this class, a lot of students I get in this class, you guys know how to memorize, but you don't know how to take notes and you don't know how to study. We're going to be talking about how to study and how to take notes alongside the content the whole way. And I'm happy to talk to you about this, Tom, but actually you have the absolute master of this in your department, Dr. Guzman. I have observed Dr. Guzman, and he is on another level in the classroom with the way that he talks to his students about how they're learning, what they're learning. It's like all the stuff that I try and do in these presentations, he's the master at. So I think the more you can engage them, talk to them about what they're learning, how they're learning, how they're studying, all that kind of thing, just be open and do it. Thank you, Tuan. Thank you. But I think that's great. I think you, and as an instructor, I think it's okay to have a certain amount of vulnerability with a certain amount, right? With your students and be like, these are the things that I struggle with in teaching this class because of certain issues I see students having. And so I want to work with you to teach you how to study, because you're the one, Tom, who knows how to study in your discipline. And you teach A and P. So like that's funny to hear you say that students come in knowing how to memorize and don't know a lot of other things. Because to me, I'm terrified of A and P because it looks like nothing but memorization for 4 months. And I get it. I know there's so much more to it, but I just thought that was interesting that you said that. So, but this is great that you're bringing this all up now, and I think it's could be a really fun conversation to have with your students, along with being important. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Well, this has been really engaging, and my neurons are crackling. I don't know about you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you, Shelly. This has been great. So we are going to record this presentation. I will send it to the CTE. We can send it out to all of you so you copy my PowerPoint as a reference. As always, if you ever need anything, you can always visit the Academic Dean's office with Kevin Lee, Rick Segovia, and I in room E103. But I want to thank you all so much for being here. Have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you all soon.